Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this year's World Tourism Day event hosted by the Institute for Hospitality and Tourism Research at Toronto Metropolitan University. My name is Tom Griffin. I'm an associate professor with the School of Hospitality and Tourism within the Ted Rogers School of Management, which is within Toronto Metropolitan University. And I'm also the assistant director of the Institute for Hospitality and Tourism Research. So before we get going, we will be making a land acknowledgement, and this land acknowledgement that you can see was created in 2014, and it's used across campus before we start our events. And it's an acknowledgement of the land, that we're in Indigenous territories. So Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship and respect. Dish, or sometimes it is called the bowl, represents what is now Southern Ontario. We all eat out of the dish, all of us that share this territory with only one spoon. That means we have to share the responsibility of ensuring the dish is never empty, which includes taking care of the land and the creatures we share it with. Importantly, there are no knives at the table, representing that we must keep the peace. So, we are very excited to have two really interesting speakers with us this evening. This is a brief outline of how the event is going to play out. So we're going to start with Dr. Daniel Scott's presentation, who's going to kind of give us an overview and some kind of really important macro trends of climate change relating to tourism. And then Shannon Guihan is going to give us a presentation from the industry perspective, from the Travel Corporation, and talk about what they are doing in response to the issues in the world, but also I suspect consumer demand and changes in motivations too. We're then going to have lots of time for questions, and so I have some questions. I know Sonia has some questions, but I really encourage everyone else to ask your questions into the chat or into the Q&A section. I'm not quite sure how those two are different yet, but we'll figure it out. And I will make sure that your questions get asked. And then we'll close up by around 7:20 to be done by 7:30. So we are the Institute for Hospitality and Tourism Research, and our mission is to facilitate and conduct research of both scholarly value and significance to the tourism and hospitality field. So we mobilize knowledge to enhance the research reputation and impact of the university, particularly in the tourism and hospitality field. So what we aim to do is to do research that's both useful for the industry and for practitioners, but is of scholarly significance as well, that we can publish and build the reputation of our university. And a big part of what we try to do is find opportunities for our students to connect and get experienced in research in relation to tourism and hospitality as well. So that's a big part of what we do. If you'd like to learn more, please find our website, follow our social media, all that good stuff. So just going to read the bios of our two speakers. First, we'll be hearing from Dr. Daniel Scott. Daniel is a professor and university research chair in climate and society, as well as the executive director of the Interdisciplinary Center on Climate Change at the University of Waterloo. He's worked extensively in the areas of climate change and global tourism, and the global tourism sector, including collaborations with the United Nations World Tourism Organization, United Nations Environment Programme, the World Meteorological Organization. Dr. Scott has been a contributing author and expert reviewer for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in their various assessment reports. And Daniel is one of the leading voices, academic voices in climate change and tourism, so I'm thrilled to have you here. And then after Daniel's presentation, we are going to hear from Shannon Guihan. Shannon regularly presents and participates in key industry forums and special committees, including a long list of acronyms, including the UNWTO, the WTTC, and PATA, Tourism Cares, and more. In 2018, she was recognized by Canadian Traveller magazine as a top 40 under 40 in the Canadian travel industry, and in 2021 as a top performer by the World Travel and Tourism Commission. She's guest lectured at Harvard University and is regularly called on by media to share insights into the development of sustainable tourism industry. She holds a master's in tourism and environmental management, where she focused on integrating the principles of sustainability into marine-based ecotourism. And she's an undergraduate degree of outdoor and recreation and environmental education from Acadia University. Her first and best job was at Sea Kayaking Guide in the home province of Newfoundland and Labrador. And since then, I've met Shannon a few years ago as a consultant in tourism, and she's now moved on to the Travel Corporation and is doing some really interesting, exciting things. So I'm really happy with the balance of the presenters here. We've got the academic and then the practitioner as well, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion and the questions that we'll have. And so, with that said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to hand it over to Daniel. And to the audience, please type your questions in. We'll save them to the end after Shannon's presented, but we will get to them, I promise. Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to try to share my screen with all of you and do the magic. There we go. All good, Tom, at your end?
That's great. Thank you.
Perfect. All right, everyone. Well, first of all, I want to thank Tom and Sonia for the invitation to be on this panel with all of you and with Shannon especially. I look forward to meeting her in person someday. I really hope that this event would have been in person this year. It's wonderful as a professor to see the level of energy that we have back on campus, and I'm sure you do as well. And in some cases, not all of our students, but I can literally see the excitement in some of their eyes to actually get back together with students, do some of their teamwork, and it's awesome to see that kind of energy going on. Nonetheless, I really look forward to our panel discussion as well, to hear the kinds of questions you have as students, as professionals working in the field, but also how we in the academy can help you, move forward on climate action and on your journey towards achieving some of the climate goals you may have set out as your organization as well. So Sonia's asked me to start with a little bit of high-level context for our session. And we all see things on climate change in the media literally every week. Sometimes it seems like every day. So I'm not going to belabor the point that, climate change is upon us. It's part of more and more of our lived experience for more of us around the world. One analysis that was done last year that 85% of the global population has already experienced weather events made worse by climate change. So this isn't a hypothetical anymore. It's not something that's 25 years out in the future. It's here. We're experiencing it, and I've just put a couple of examples on the screen from things that we've seen this summer, from a third of Pakistan being underwater, 600-year-old hunger stones reemerging from the Danube River, fires in many places in the world. So as the UN said, this is a defining challenge of our time. It's going to continue to test us as society, and it's going to continue to test us as a tourism sector working together. The other point that I want to emphasize off the start, though, is this is a grand challenge we can win. We can never lose sight of that, because in my view, defeatism is just as paralyzing as the climate denial crowd that's out there as well. So just as one of the hats that I wear on our campus, I'm the director of our Master of Climate Change program, and we're in our 10th year. Our 10th class came into orientation week last week. And so I went back to see how the world has changed for the good over those 10 years. So 10 years ago, we didn't have a Paris Climate Agreement. We didn't have 40 countries declaring a climate emergency. We didn't have more than 70 now countries committing, and thousands of businesses committing to net zero emissions. We didn't have millions of youth mobilizing in the streets regularly and demanding real climate action. And here at home in Canada, we had no pan-Canadian framework. We had no emission reduction plan. We had no Net Zero Accountability Act, no national adaptation strategy, which is coming in a couple of weeks, I think. So whether it's the world, whether it's Canada, we're in a much better place in terms of governance to take on climate change, and we can't lose sight of that. Now, all of us have to keep the pressure on some of those decision makers and personally be part of that social change that's needed for climate change and a just transition that comes with it. So with that said, the $1 trillion question for the evening is, what does all this mean for tourism? You've all seen a figure like this on your left. Where are we headed? Is it a +2 world, +3, +4? And you've seen things like the red line there. If we're unsuccessful in the Paris Climate Agreement, what that can lead to in a sort of +4 world is increasingly off the table, because we do have a whole series of climate policies for most countries around the world that, if those were successful, those pledges that we've made to the Paris Climate Agreement, now we'd land in that sort of light blue area. And that's still an if, but there's also the possibility that those pledges will be ratcheted up. That's what the process for the Paris Climate Agreement's about. And then at the bottom in that dark blue, that's where we want to land. We want to land in that, +2, hopefully 1.5 world. Although, from a scientific perspective, that is increasingly off the table as well. So in all likelihood, somewhere in that light blue, between the light blue and the dark blue, is where we're going to end up. Now, the key point for tourism is, regardless of which of those futures we land in, we have two fundamental challenges to address. First of all is carbon risk. How do we decarbonize tourism over the next 30 years? And more broadly, what is the place of tourism in a global economy that has decarbonized? And then on the second challenge, we have to manage, it's the climate risk. We have to manage the unavoidable impacts, some of which, as we've said, they're upon us now. They're going to accelerate, and hopefully through our responses, what kind of sustainable tourism co-benefits can we generate through our response? So I'm going to say a few words about each of these core challenges before we turn it over to Shannon later on. So the first one, take a look at, what does tourism in a climate disrupted world look like? Again, each of these pictures come from, different parts of North America that we've seen over the span of this summer, things that we're already experiencing in terms of impacting operations, tourism operations, investments, demand. And these are going to accelerate. We know that in some regions. And we have to do more as academics to understand those, to help policymakers and decision makers of different types understand those risks and how to respond to them, but also how effective our responses might actually be. And I'll give you a couple of examples of each of these. We'll try to give you something close to home first, and then something at a more global scale. And so if we take, in terms of risk to part of our tourism industry here in Ontario, we can look at the two different futures of our ski tourism in Ontario. So under the blue, which is the current Paris pledges, at the bottom, you see all the different colors. Those are the average ski season lengths for all of Ontario resorts. Quebec and New England are different competitors. And you can see under that successful Paris pledges, most of those colors in Ontario stay green. So that's this average season length of 100 days or longer. That's almost where we are now. That's financial valuability all the way through the 2080s. So that's the good news. That's the future we want. On the other side of the figure, you see under a higher emission scenario, a lot of those circles have turned red, orange, yellow, all of that being less than 100-day average season. So under those sort of conditions, we would probably lose our ski industry here in Southern Ontario. And so that's why, from a winter tourism, whether it's skiing, snowmobiling, and other types of activities, those industries really should be strong advocates for climate action here in the province and in Canada as well. And a second example is, many of us either do work in the Caribbean. Most of us have traveled there at one time or the other. It's one of the most tourism dependent regions of the world. It's also one of the most climate change vulnerable regions of the world. And in that region, tourism faces, there's 6 different risks that I've put up here, many of which we know too little about, and we know almost nothing about how they're going to interact over time and space. And some might think of this, well, that's something that academics like to understand, these sort of complex questions, but it's not just an academic question anymore. As I've said at the bottom there, the financial industry has mandatory climate risk disclosure requirements coming. Different stock markets are debating the different guidelines now, but I would estimate in the next year to 3 years, any publicly traded company, tourism company, is going to have to assess their risk and tell the financial world how are you going to grapple with it, successfully or otherwise. And so that's what's coming, and that's going to trickle its way down to other businesses that may not be publicly traded as well. Banks are going to ask the same questions, insurers and others. And then when we move to the global scale, we try to understand what climate change or climate risk is going to mean for global tourism development on the grand scale and over time. And in this analysis, we used the best indicators that we could find that represented the geography of the world, quite widely. So most countries were included. And what you can see in this map is the real uneven geography of climate risk. You see some countries, Canada, New Zealand, parts of Northern Europe, which may actually benefit from some new market opportunities in tourism through climate change. And then you see the regions of the world at highest risk, and many of those regions are regions that are expected where tourism is supposed to be the strongest growth, an important part of international development strategy, and the climate justice implications of that are unmistakable when you look at this map. And so now I just want to say a couple words on that second big challenge that we have, which is carbon risk, reducing carbon in the tourism economy, and some of the other risks that go with that. So you've seen things like flight shaming in the news the last couple of years. We've seen again just this year some kind of highly vulnerable countries looking to use air travel, a levy on air travel as a way to raise finances for losses and damages. We see new investment in electric aircraft, other electrification, and those will be challenges that tourism has to work through as well. So again, I'll give you a couple examples of both how do we reduce our emissions, but also that the solutions to reducing those emissions, they have important consequences that we want to understand as well. So again, for a local or a Canadian example, Canadian policy says we're not going to sell new ice engines as of 2035. So everything will have to be electrified that's in the new car fleet sales. What does that EV transition mean for tourism for Canada? Are we ready for it? So we looked at the question of Parks Canada as a nationwide tourism provider. They have on their website 94 different road trip itineraries, centered in and around the different national parks. And we looked at criteria for feasibility and tourism convenience. What we found was 25% of multi-day trips were impossible with EVs. One-day trips were better, 80% of them were possible to convenience, so that was the good news. And then on the right side of this figure, we took 11 newly developed itineraries for Parks Canada and assessed them with the same criteria. And what you see is, most are down in that sort of red area, which is not convenient to even not possible with average EVs right now. So that wasn't part of their development. That wasn't on the radar with Parks Canada, and that's something we want to really change. And we want to change that quickly because the infrastructure investment, let alone the environmental assessments, et cetera, just to get the electricity into their campgrounds so that you could charge your EV on site is going to be a massive undertaking that's going to take 10 years. So if they start now, hopefully we'll be ready for that 2035 deadline. When we go up to the sort of sector scale, what is tourism's responsibility for global emissions? Our estimate in 2007 was about 5%. Newer work is suggesting up to about 8%. That, if you put it in a country context, is about Canada, UK, and France put together at the lower end, and you'd have to add Germany to that to be at the higher end. So the point being, we're not going to get a pass as a sector because the Paris Climate Agreement can't be successful if tourism emissions are not controlled. So we know that's coming. We have to handle that. The sector knows that. The Glasgow Declaration is the newer emission reduction commitment, where they looked at promising about 50% reduction over the next decade, so by 2030, and they wanted to achieve a net zero as soon as possible before 2050. The challenge with that is credibility. And the reason I say that, UNWTO's own analysis of just transportation, as I've shown in the bottom right, shows growth of at least 25% through 2030. And transportation represents 50–60% of tourism's global emission footprint. So if those grow, that means the rest of tourism would have to completely decarbonize by 2030 in the next 8 years. So we know that's not feasible. So these are some of the challenges on the credibility side. The 700 plus companies and organizations that signed up for the Glasgow Declaration, that's a great first step, and that's a step forward. We hope to see in their action plans that they're going to develop for in the next month or so at the next COP meeting, that those are really sound, and then we'll have some good news to report on that front in the not too distant future. And when we shift to the sort of biggest challenges, some of that lack of leadership at a global scale represents another threat to tourism. And in there, I've looked at, I think, 5 or 6 global net zero roadmaps where they map out how could we achieve the Paris Climate Agreement. Not one of them even mentions tourism. So there's 10% of the global economy that's essentially being overlooked in those. And Sonia had asked the question offline before, what about air travel? And so I put this slide in at the last minute, which looks at multiple different analyses of how do you decarbonize air travel, the aviation sector. And what you can see on this graphic is each of the different analyses, and there's more of them, each come at it in a slightly different way. And the implications for tourism are very different. So the little black bar that you see sort of anywhere from 1/3 to 2/3 up the way, that's how much emissions are left. And you can see how different those are after technology and operations have been taken off. And then another difference you can quickly see is that pink box is demand management, which means freezing the size of aviation at a certain size, not letting it grow in the way ICAO and others would see unrestrictedly. So those are some real differences. And I just give you one example in the bottom right from the very influential International Energy Agency. How did they come up with their strategy? So they achieved -80%, so not completely net zero, but they do that through some pretty important steps. So business and long haul, frozen at 2019 levels, no flights more than or under an hour. So Toronto, Montreal, Toronto, Ottawa, those wouldn't happen anymore unless it was with electric aircraft. They did not include hydrogen aircraft, and then flight costs end up going about 80%. That's not a deal breaker for most, but it does have implications for who can fly and how often. And then one of the questions they didn't ask is, there's a limited supply, very limited supply of sustainable aviation fuels. How are we going to allocate that? Is it going to be on a user pay basis or based on climate justice principles? Those questions aren't really even being asked at this point. So a final point before I turn over to Shannon, a key question is tourism ready? And the short answer is, well, no. But neither is, virtually any other sector or country for that matter. We're all trying to sort this out with a lot of moving pieces. And so one of the points that I do want to emphasize, though, is on the left, our analysis of tourism policy around the world has really shown that there's, it's incoherent with climate policy. As one example, Caribbean countries often come to the UN climate conferences advocating with their slogan of 1.5 degrees to stay alive, and that's true for them, absolutely. But at the same time, their tourism departments are chasing the Chinese market and the most carbon intensive markets around the world. The two just, you can't square that circle. So these are some of the disconnects that we see that are pretty obvious out there, and that tourism is missing in most nationally determined contributions, which are a key part of the Paris Climate Agreement governance. Tells you that the place of tourism really needs to be elevated within policymakers and governments more broadly. So just as I turn it over to Shannon, I want to leave you with this point on the, hopefully you can see it on your right, which is a bit of a take-home message from Dennis Shaw at SCIF. Hopefully many of you are familiar with them and some of the interesting work that they do. And it's hard to contemplate this quote when we're just coming out of a pandemic with the massive disruption that it's shown us. But as Dennis emphasized, climate change is going to transform tourism over the course of all of our careers. It's already in the early days of that. And we really need more events like this where we can bring together experts from across the sector, foster some of the collaboration, innovation that we're going to need to really mobilize solutions really with the same urgency that we had when we first responded to COVID. And with that, thank you. And I really look forward to the questions that many of you have. And I will hopefully successfully stop sharing, Tom.
Thanks, Daniel. That was really revealing and raised some kind of really interesting tensions and challenges. And yeah, I got a list of questions, but Shannon, over to you. It'd be great to hear about what you guys are doing too. And to everybody in the audience, I realize it's come to my attention that the chat function does not work. It's been disabled, but if you do have questions, please type them into the Q&A box and I will be able to see them, and we will get them covered, I promise. Shannon, thank you.
Thank you. And you can see my main screen, right? This works?
Yes, it looks great.
I'm a Teams user. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for inviting me here today. As I was introduced, my name is Shannon Guihan, and I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer for the Travel Corporation. Thank you, Daniel, for that analysis. Really just reporting in clear terms, perhaps some of the most clear terms I've seen. So I appreciate that. What the world is facing, what the industry is facing. I disagree with none of it, of course. And what I'm here to talk to you all about today is what we are trying to do from the perspective of the business that I work for, the Travel Corporation, in terms of responding. It's not easy for us. We have a few unique challenges at the Travel Corporation. That's not true of a lot of our competitors. Our industry, of course, is heavily reliant on heavy emitting transportation. Yet in turn, destinations are reliant on foreign earnings through tourism. So neither of those 2 points I take lightly, nor do I feel they can be addressed in silos, which some of the rhetoric often does that. And I think that that's very short-sighted of us. Climate change, and any approach to climate change, must be a systems approach. And that's another point that I try really hard to make, because one of these solutions cannot happen or have any impact meaningfully in a silo. So before I get into it, and I might be speaking a little bit more quickly to get to those questions, but I think it's very useful for you to appreciate who we are. I suspect several of you will have heard of the Travel Corporation. Very few appreciate the breadth of this organization. So we are a privately held group of travel brands, and the private is important, I think, when you appreciate what it is that we're doing and how we approach this. We span multiple travel styles and demographics. These are all of our brands that you see on our page. We built this structure of brands specific to our sustainability strategy. This is the structure we use for sales and marketing. It is only sort of a form of categorization that we use when we're establishing sustainability targets. Unlike many tour operators, we own a good deal of assets. So 17 hotels, I believe it's 13 river cruise ships, more than 500 vehicles, more than 85% of our offices are owned, a winery. And so we understand in great detail our scope 1 and 2 footprint. Scope 3, we understand, yet we are improving our data. We're gaining great more visibility into scope 3. It will be in hand by Q2 next year. And so it is strong yet evolving. One thing I will tell you is what we're not doing, and that's having to convince anyone at the organization that action is necessary. So I come to you from a place of privilege where I can scoff at you if you ask me the business case for climate action or sustainability in travel, which is really dreamy, to be honest. It is accepted at the group that sustainability, climate action included, is akin to business resiliency. And that speaks volumes. And it's interesting, this is a 104-year-old business, family run. And I believe that there's a very strong correlation between the ability from a family run perspective to see long-term and to see the challenges and to address them than it might be the case in some other private or public businesses. I digress. Okay, where am I now? So we have built a plan. So in 2020, we released 11 sustainability goals, the first 3 of which are climate related. The following year, we released our climate action plan, which you'll see here on your screen. What's very notable is that we are currently finalizing a reset of our climate action plan. This reset will include our science-based reduction targets, which are in the very rigorous process of being validated. The new plan will also not involve offsets, as we are moving beyond offsets to prioritize our reduction efforts. And we're doing that with great purpose. We have introduced offsets in some part of the business, so divesting will be a complicated process, primarily from a marketing communications perspective. But someone once told me that when it comes to storytelling and marketing on sustainability, one must be vulnerable, because this is an ever-evolving process. It's not necessarily to say you're always wrong, you're always changing the goalposts, but you have to listen to what individuals like Daniel are telling you, and you need to double down when you need to do so. So I want to talk a little bit about what our carbon footprint is. So in 2019, and please note, these numbers are constantly being updated as we gain greater and greater visibility. So in 2019, we estimated that all TTC trips were responsible for the lion's share of our carbon footprint, and it was the equivalent to 50,000 cars driven for a year by the math. By contrast, our business emissions had a much smaller, yet of course impactful footprint. This is not unlike our sector. What's different is that I would argue most operators have a much greater bucket of scope 3 emissions than we do, because we are heavily on owned assets, which is uncommon, as I said. The challenge, of course, is that we don't own and thus have very limited sway over scope 3. And so this is why collaboration with our peers and destinations is critical. And this is arguably the greatest value that something such as the Glasgow Declaration, of which we did our participants in, and one of its, I suppose, founders, the Travel Foundation, it's why we work so heavily with them as sort of a third-party intermediary to bring together non-competitive collaboration, where we can work with definite destinations to put the infrastructure that I need for EVs in place. So the collaboration in our industry, I would say, has never before been stronger. I actually think it was just lip service prior to the past several years. So as I mentioned earlier, we're in the process of having our science-based carbon reduction targets approved by really the only third-party verifier of targets I'm concerned about. That's the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Now, this means that they are reviewing in great detail our footprint on our baseline 2019 year to ensure that our targets are robust enough. If that wasn't difficult enough, you'll appreciate that 2019 represented the biggest travel year that we've had. We are not yet back to those figures, which in many cases is positive, yet we've seen a considerable dip in business since 2019, which does pose some challenge for the math on carbon accounting. Specifically, the reason we're going with Science-Based Targets Initiative is that what they do is enable us to make a promise to our consumers that what we are doing in terms of climate action is, in theory, meant to be keeping with a 1.5 degree temperature increase, though, as Daniel pointed out, that figure is increasing, unfortunately, and that's due to inaction. While we are weeks away from finalizing these targets, I will gladly share the working figures. Our reduction targets involve a near-term 2030 target of 46% reduction in scope 1 and 2 footprint and 27% reduction in scope 3. I would like to see that 27% reduction higher. It's already quite aggressive with the structure that we have in place. And so I think a lot with a lot of anxiety about scope 3, if I'm being honest. Practically speaking, what does that look like for our business? So we need to see and are currently engaged in reducing energy use at all of our Red Carnation hotels by 25%. Now they are already 100% run on renewables. Now we need to switch in just making them more efficient. We are setting a very ambitious target to replace 75% of our fleet with low or zero emission vehicles. Now this is going to be a challenge because, of course, in Australia and South Africa, it's not even on the runway for them. But in Europe, where we will start, it very much is. And in Europe, we're also starting to see really wonderful activity from the destinations. So Scotland, for example, is starting to invest in the infrastructure that we need to make purchase of EVs justifiable. So these are the things that are starting to happen quite quickly. I mean, I suppose quickly is relative, but they're happening. And we also need to reduce fuel use by uniworld ships by 25%. So those are the ships that run on the Danube and inland rivers in Europe. The challenge is we actually don't have the technology. Nobody does. So that's why we work with academics. We're actually working with TU Delft University on an EU-funded project. We're the only passenger company on board. What they're doing is they're trying to find available technology to transition inland shipping to net zero, because of course the same technologies that cruise ships can use it cannot on river cruising, largely due to weight and other restrictions. And we have a plan to finance our reductions, and it will be announced in the coming months. But in short, that is what we would otherwise invest in offsets is being invested into the business quite heavily. And that is going to go into scope 1 and 2 owned infrastructure on the projects that I've outlined on our roadmap. It's going to be made available to business leaders for local projects that they can identify that I don't know about in their offices and regions that we can assess to determine if it's going to support our reduction targets enough. And then it will eventually go to scope 3 once we have the visibility into precisely how we can reduce scope 3, which is coming in Q2. I'm a real treat at a party, can you tell? So alternatively, we are also using the power of our not-for-profit foundation, the Treadright Foundation, to invest in nature-based solutions. We're deeply aware that we need to invest in all potential solutions for carbon removal. And the threat to tourism that is not spoken about enough is the other side of climate change, which is rapid loss of biodiversity. Tourism industry is really fascinating because we share the same resource, that being a place. And it behooves us to protect that place. Quality control has been greatly lacking, obviously. And so, this is why through our Treadright Foundation, we're thrilled to be investing in carbon removal solutions to help accelerate technology that's upcoming or scale proven solutions. So that will include projects such as Project Vesta or Greenwave. These are nature-based solutions based out of the US, and we're currently working to identify 4 to 6 more projects worldwide. So yeah, this is a very high level summary of our efforts, and I'm very happy and eager to take questions on what it is that we're doing. And I'm happy to talk tactics. So it's very important to me, and I think it's very important to the marketplace when we're talking about climate action, what it is we need to do. It cannot just be up here anymore. And certainly, a brand such as ours, all of our brands are sort of, at a high precipice from which to fall. And this is This is why we need to provide transparency and a sufficient enough detail into what it is that we're doing to address sustainability and climate action. And it's also important, I think, for our peers and colleagues to be able to see what's working for us so that they can potentially replicate or tell us where we're going wrong equally as useful. Over to you, Tom.
Great,
I don't
thanks,
know how
Shannon.
to stop sharing, though. You're going to have to make me do that.
I don't know how to make it. Let's see. There you go. Found the button. Great, thank you. That was really, a great balance to Daniel's presentation too, and to see what's happening on the ground in some specific situations. So to the audience, there are a couple of questions. I'll get to them in a second. Please do post your questions in the Q&A, and if you're feeling brave, you can raise your hand and I can actually bring you off mute and you can talk to the big wide world as well. So feel free to ask your questions that way. Shannon, I had a question of clarification for you, actually. You mentioned a couple of times about scope 1, 2, and 3, and I just wondered if you could briefly explain what that means.
Okay, I feel like Daniel would be better to do this, but in my terms, 1 and 2 is that which we own, and 2 is everything else that's critical in providing our business.
Yeah, Daniel, is that fair?
Yeah, and as another example within Parks Canada, they'll look at their buildings and their fleets as part of their 1s and 2s, electricity they buy, but then scope 3, which is the big one for them, is all of these people traveling to their parks, either explicitly for parks tourism or partially for parks tourism. What part of that scope 3 do you take on as a Parks Canada agency? Because they do have requirements to reduce their emissions. And they do it sort of based on their accounting system because they can track that. But it gets a bit murky when you get in, as Shannon said, when you get into scope 3, what's yours, what's shared with somebody else, how do you measure it? It's tough.
Yeah, I can see that. And especially as a tour operator, I guess, when you're trying to build, partnerships with bus companies and tour guiding companies and on the ground in the different destinations. I mean, do you build those kind of requirements into those contracts, or is it?
Well, there's a few things. We use operational control to determine if it's in and out of scope we follow GHG protocol. But when you're going through the Science-Based Targets Initiative, GHG is not good enough for these guys. So this assessment that we're doing, you are starting to see duplication of scope 3, and it's difficult because it will make our job more difficult. At the same time, if we all treated it as a hot potato, we'd be in a world of hurt too. So it's murky, at best.
Right, great, thank you. I'm going to go to a couple of questions in the Q&A. So Anita is asking a question. She's actually got a couple of questions. So Anita is a student in our classes. Hi, Anita. Nice to see you. And she's saying, what's been done to bring the role of tourism in climate change to the attention of different governments? And I guess, that's an interesting question, because I think tourism in general, bringing the attention of tourism in general to governments is a challenge. Like, is there much interaction with tourism, climate change and governments? Is that something that's happening?
We looked at, as I said, about 60 some countries where we had either a tourism policy or a climate policy that had tourism in it, or vice versa. And they really weren't connected. The ones that were more strongly connected actually came from a climate change lead, be that an environment department, going to the tourism and sort of bringing them in, as opposed to the tourism policy being written with climate change in it. So there is a lot of work to be done there. There was a really European Tourism Council. We did some work for them, and then they had a follow-up workshop with all of their member countries. And I was really excited to see the report and the recommendations and what was coming out of that. I saw sort of off the grid version of that, and then COVID hit, and I haven't seen it since. So I'm hoping Europe, and Shannon alluded to this as well, they're going to kind of lead the way because they are a huge player in tourism. They're also the leader in the climate space. And if not them, I don't know where it comes from. So I'm hoping in the next couple of years, you'll really see movement there, and that will give other countries something to build on.
And I can, if I may, I would say we're already starting to see movement, though not specifically tourism focused. So we're still hearing destinations say sustainability, climate's more important, yet their DMOs are more concerned about partnerships than partnership dollars. So the DMOs, their approach and perspective, gross generalization, hasn't necessarily changed. Where we're getting sort of, I guess, triggers of action is out of transport. Public policy funds are starting to be opened up to the tourism industry, where they may have initially only been for city transport sort of things. We are having to sort of bob and weave on regulations with respect to what is being required of us on our ships as we cross through rivers. So it's great. I believe very strongly in the regulating hand because it evens the playing field. And so I'm starting to see quite a lot of that out of the UK, a ton, certainly on buildings and hotels. So it's happening, but I don't think it's not being driven by tourism.
And just to follow up on that, Shannon, is that challenging as a tourism company working in many different countries with many different regulations on what you are required to do, and in terms of pollution emissions and so on? Like, is that a challenge to kind of make that consistent across your brands and across your trips?
It's not difficult to make it consistent across our brands and trips because we have built a structure that enables us to implement these changes. We've taken sort of a business function approach to sustainability. So in a perfect world, in however many years, my job won't be a job because it will be built into the structures of the organization. What's difficult is bobbing and weaving when the regulations are teased, but then changed, and then it's just sort of politics, really, when we need to, on Uniworld, they're telling me I need biodiesel, yet I need to put a significant investment into the ship to use biodiesel. And do I want to do that? Because biodiesel is not going to get me there. So I would like to leapfrog it for what's next. But what's next? I have no idea. So those are the things that get really, like I can't buy an EV in Toronto because I can't plug it in on my street. Those sorts of very annoying things.
But that's a huge issue that Shannon's identified. So that one of the things the International Energy Agency set out is said to governments collectively, you need to set out your fuel strategy, whether it's for shipping, whether it's cruise, and give the industry where are you going to help invest? Is it a hydrogen or ammonia based? What is the fuel of the future? Are you going to leapfrog high-speed rail by using electric aircraft in the Canadian context? Because it would take us 50 years to build a high-speed rail line to Montreal. Those are the kinds of high-level strategies that not just tourism, but others need to know, where are we going so that I'm investing in the right places and not wasting money 3 years down the track when you decide on something different.
Yeah, I can see how that's a challenge for sure. Yeah, thank you. I have another question from Anita, and Sonia and I both raised this question separately earlier. So a number of people on the call are tourism undergraduate students, interested in sustainability broadly. What advice do you have people wanting to enter an industry that is going through these challenges of how do we sustain business that relies on flying people and causing these, what can they do to get involved? What's the education or the associations that they should be getting involved with, things that they should be thinking about as they begin to think about graduation and moving into tourism as an industry?
Well, you've got a mentor sitting in a bike shed right now. That shows there are multiple paths to this. Some of us came to this by accident. Some were properly trained in sustainability and business, and then brought that knowledge and that skill set to tourism. Others go through the tourism sector training, learn the business, but then they have to go out and seek some of the sustainability training. You know, if climate change is a passion of yours, then there's an even more specific place that I think, as I said, as climate risk disclosure becomes a bigger part of things, more and more companies, I'm seeing that with consulting firms, they're building teams to take on that kind of thing. And if you specialize in a sector like tourism, I don't think you'll be short for work for the next little while. So there's no one clear path to get there. And the more people we can showcase, like Shannon, sort of, this is my path to get there, but somebody else took a different path, but we're both making a huge difference. That's some of the things I think we really need to showcase for students.
Yeah, and I can say, I mean, honestly, Tom, this question 5 or 6 years ago filled me with dread, and it's different. It's entirely different now. So my role started at the group in 2019, subsequent to Utopia, Exodus, Intrepid has for a long time. All of these brands, we all work together because we all need one another's support because we have the same challenge. And so the roles are becoming more plentiful. I absolutely agree, though, is that consulting is a very interesting approach. Reason being is not a lot of tour operators. And remember that it's not just tour operators. There's hotels, and hoteliers are a great place, actually. They hire pretty regularly these days on this. Where was I going? But a lot of the industry is small to medium-sized enterprises. In Canada, it's typically like, what, 80% would say SMEs. They're not going to hire resources. They're going to look for off-the-shelf tools. They're going to look for some limited consulting because it's expensive. So there's not a lot of operators that are going to hire whole teams. I have a climate expert on my team because it is not me. I'm the generalist. And so, yeah, I think the consulting angle is a really interesting approach. And hotels, they're certainly further ahead and always will be than sort of the core operator attraction space.
Great, thank you. Good advice. Rachel Dodds has a question. And Rachel, if I butcher this, please let me know and you can raise your hand and come off mute. But Rachel says, how does a private company justify the return on investment for EV fleets? Is it just a sunk capital cost, or can the support for this be shifted by government? I think that's what you meant, Rachel. Can governments help shift the demand for this?
Yeah, it's both. And I think it's a progression. So for instance, and it's not easy. So we just launched the first EV of many in London. The price increase was offset by the fuel savings. Done deal. But they're short haul. We don't have the capacity for long haul coaching that the sort of normal coaching space has yet for infrastructure and technology. The buses aren't there yet. The buses probably won't be there before. I mean, my supplier says maybe 2026 or 27, but I'm going to be a guinea pig. And in Scotland, we're looking at some mini coaches that is going to be subsidized by the government, because so then we can bring them in as prices will then, right? That's the thing. It's a sliding. It's a sort of it's no one fixed point. Can't justify it in the US right now. Full stop. Again, Australia and South Africa are going to give me nightmares for many years. But in Europe, it's becoming more affordable, and also the price of fuel is really helping me out right now when I'm in the boardroom and I'm pitching something. So unfortunately, it's no one clear answer because it depends on where you're buying, it depends on where you're using, and it depends on when you're buying.
Yeah. And the other little tweak to that, Rachel, is where you invest first should depend on what grid you're supplying those things on. So in a Canadian context, if you do it in a Quebec or Ontario, you're essentially decarbonizing that transportation leg. You do it in Alberta, you're not making a hail of beans difference because of the grid there where you're charging up. So where you invest first but Alberta's grid in theory should be clean by 2030. So if you go, Quebec, Ontario, BC first, by the time you get around to Alberta, the grid should be on your side as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So where I know I can't invest in EVs in South Africa, we are assessing investing in the grid, in generating and providing renewable, because they're starting to make private companies more able to do that by taking some of the red tape out. And so in that case, we can invest heavily there in renewables, and it's sort of an interim before we can do the same on transport.
Rachel's just made another comment that it's really important to also think about that just because an EV depends on where its electricity is coming from, on the quality of the emissions, and she just wanted to stress that point that you just made. Yeah. So I have a question from an anonymous attendee. So and I'll read it. I mean, I might add a little twist to it at the end, but the question is, how is Canada reconciling that they are one of the worst in terms of per capita emissions? And I mean, that's a broad question. And for me, the tourism twist on that is the reputation of Canada internationally as a place of natural beauty and an environmentally friendly community is a very broad perception of what Canada is as a destination. Do you have anything to offer to that question and that perhaps dichotomy?
I can speak to on the climate policy side. It is a big challenge, and a very significant portion of our emissions come from two provinces and an oil and gas sector that we're trying to find ways to decarbonize, but that's kind of a misnomer in some respects. So that's not going away anytime soon. That being said, if you look at other parts of Canada from a regional perspective, even a tourism perspective, today in Quebec or Ontario, you can essentially have a net zero holiday. You go to Blue Mountain for skiing or Tremblant. If you're driving an EV, their snowmaking, their lifts, et cetera, are on a clean grid already. You're essentially, net zero compatible with some tourism products today. So it really is a regional perspective. And if you took Europe and made it a country like Canada, you'd have some of the same problems, and you'd have coal-based grids in Poland. Germany now coal is having a comeback because of the situation in Ukraine. So it's not cut and dry, even in places that we think of as very progressive on the climate file as well.
Yeah, and I would say when it comes to reputation, that's true of every destination. You probably think of Iceland as a place of vast open streets with nobody else around. And when I started working there 12 years ago, that would have been true. But now there's a slew of coaches behind you in that vast open space. So tourism is guilty of selling what it was and doing so for a very long time. Canada's forever going to be Mounties and mountains, and I'm from the East Coast.
Yeah, no, that's a
got
fair
a lot
point.
of trees. So yeah, I think that's the really clever marketeers.
Yeah. Justin has a question aimed at Shannon, but Daniel, if you have something as well. With destinations mandating travel based on the climate or environmental effects, for example, Venice diverting large cruise ships, has the Travel Corporation encountered any destination mandates that have stopped you from doing what you were doing and you had to change because of the destination regulations?
We try to stay ahead of them, and we try to use them. We haven't seen any that impact us negatively. We're not blue sea cruising, I should say. So for instance, we know that several major centers are going to soon stop diesel powered vehicles from entering city center. There's talks of a few, that's great for us. What that does to me is that escalates my need for EVs. Again, the regulatory world being useful for me. And it also puts our experienced design team on notice to build around that. So those are powerful tools that a destination has that I urge them to use. I'm sure we're going to get caught out one day, and that's fine. There's that is afoot. So if you are in the tourism business right now and you have no visibility into these things coming down the line, then that's sort of license to operate stuff, frankly.
I mean, which destinations are you finding are most progressive in terms of their climate change policy that you're dealing with right now?
That might be a better question for Daniel, because I'm
Sure.
seeing more from where it results.
Yeah, it's not, as Shannon said, a lot of these changes aren't being driven by tourism sector or stakeholders at all. It's the transportation sector is evolving, city planning is evolving, and building, and those policies that are really external to tourism, or they're influencing tourism, which we've always said, like a lot of this is going to be beyond our control, but a lot of the things like cleaning the grid helps us all, right? So those are the systematic changes that tourism should absolutely be championing, because if you decarbonize the grid, you've done a whole heck of a lot of good to decarbonize your hotels just based on the energy going into them. So those are the kinds of big level things that tourism should be absolutely advocating. That being said, I think, there are certain countries that are starting to look at what is the place of tourism. And sort of just at one example, you may have seen France was still debating, but looking at putting an end to 1 hour flights, anything that could be done on high speed rail. Like, so they were looking at that from a tourism as well as intercity, but making that modal shift a mandatory thing, a regulatory thing. You just wouldn't get airport slots for that. So those are some high level changes that we might see more of in different parts of the tourism economy.
We've got a question about, I think it builds upon your comment, Shannon, about the Travel Corporation and the Intrepids and the G Adventures of the world are talking to each other and trying to do the right thing and work together. Is that a fairly small group of tour operators and travel companies that are doing that, or do you think are the really big players getting involved in this too? Or
I mean, it depends on what it is you do and for whom. So sort of TUI and EasyJet, we can collaborate with them via the Travel Foundation or ABTA, the Association of British Travel. Well, they're not called that anymore, just ABTA. From time to time, but there's not a lot of crossover on sort of what you might crudely call our product, and they're asset heavy in a resort airline type of way. So they're a different beast altogether. Have not worked with G, but have worked with Intrepid on a number of occasions, well, just regularly, frankly, because we're trying to make sure that apples to apples is happening when it comes to carbon. There's not really any methodology on trying to measure the carbon footprint of your trip. And so they really helped us when we had to build our custom tool, and that's a reciprocal relationship. Travelopia, who own Exodus, we talk to them regularly. So it's a small group. Flight Center, the head of sustainability for Flight Center Global, who's based out of Australia. It's a small group, but it's a relatively impactful group, if you will. And then when it comes to sort of the smaller, more niche operators, again, their challenges are very different, but they will, through forums, seek input and guidance from any one of us who are maybe a little further down the path, and it's a very open conversation.
And Daniel, thank you, Shannon. Daniel, do you see any of the big players in this? Is anyone that's doing something particularly interesting, like the major travel companies?
Well, there are a few that have adopted, and as Shannon's already alluded to, for their company, that are using the science-based targets, which I think is sort of the gold standard going forward, and that's what the financial markets are going to look to as well. So those are the sort of early movers, but the early movers are doing it right, and that we should all look towards. And again, it's difficult, as Shannon said, when you're an SME versus a bigger company that can have the capacity. But those bigger players they're gonna shift the needle for so many other things because they're sort of integrated across the sector, and so that's good to see. I'd love to see more tourism companies in that sort of leadership category. But that's certainly the hope of something that will come out of that Glasgow Declaration that will motivate and bring together more companies to do that.
Yeah, great, thank you. I have another question from Anita, and it's one connected to one I had prepared as well, and it's about the impact of consumers' willingness and motivations to choose places based on climate impacts. Daniel, you mentioned you could drive to Blue Mountain and have a net zero vacation. Do you guys see consumers' motivations and willingness and questions increase, changing relating to climate?
I can take this one. It's one of my favorite questions. Because yes and no. And for those in the middle camp, it's not my concern, because if we want to have license to operate in an industry to operate in, and we're going to do this, the consumer is going to come along later on this one. There's all sorts of consumer sentiment surveys out there. They are willing to spend a little more money, that they would like response. I'm not sure I buy it because I don't see the questions coming down the pipe. I don't, and I'm, again, gross generalization, it depends. The youth market is a little more curious and they want to know a little bit more. But then you have to look at, there's the cruising market, which is a very different individual versus someone who wants to use sort of soft adventure travel. So it's hard to generalize, though I do not use consumer demand as an argument for doing anything in sustainability. I'll be honest with you, and I don't think it's not the holy grail, because if you want to have a consumer in 10 years, then this is where you need to be, and those consumers are going to come along. So I do believe the industry, the sector, has a massive responsibility, regardless of what consumers say they want right now.
Yeah, I agree with everything Shannon just said. This is systemic change is what needs to happen. When we look around our neighbors, depending on which neighbor you look at, how they operate either their vehicles, their air conditioning, some do it on the basis of carbon and energy savings, some do not for various reasons. And so we've looked at what does price signal do. So there's been good studies. We've done stuff on the UK air passenger duty. Did it actually did it influence the geography of people where they traveled? We saw a little bit of an effect from their longest range, their distance D to C, but not a lot. Carbon labeling, I would argue, might have a more influential, because some people, consumers, just genuinely don't know. Like, what does that cruise versus that trip to Vegas versus whatever else, if they really care about it, they can't make an informed decision like we can with vehicles and homes and appliances and so many other things. So when that day comes, then at least they'll be armed with the information, and you'll know that their decisions being based on an informational base. And then there's been some actual surveys. Would you change your travel patterns because of climate? And probably 80 to 90% of the answer was, I'm on holidays, leave me the hell alone.
It's important. I'm on holidays, leave me alone, which is why it is my job to make it easy to try and educate in a way that's not offensive. Because if I am trying to be the choice and work with the sector, and this is the royal I, all of my team and everyone that I work with, if we make it difficult for average bear to purchase, or they feel guilty, then they might choose another option when we want them to choose what's a little bit more responsible. But the point is, it's our job to do this. The consumer doesn't want to be bothered on holiday, rightly or wrongly.
And ultimately, the entire sector has to be decarbonized.
Yes.
over a certain period of time, whether it's faster or slower, everything has to change in the career paths of many of the people who are listening to this discussion.
I mean, it's a very small thing, but it reminds me of, as a user of Google Maps and Google Flights. I mean, the information is now inserted in there about this is the most fuel efficient route to your destination, and on Google Flights, this is a minus or plus average percent on the emissions. If you're changing 5 times, it's going to be high emissions, and and I'm sure I know there are arguments about the calculations behind that and the impact, but I guess on one level it's just raising awareness of that you are about to take a trip, whether it's by car or by plane, and this is having an impact, and so you're having some kind of choice here to choose this flight or this route or this route. I mean, is that a fair summary, or do you have something more sophisticated to add to that?
I think the OTAs getting into this, it's difficult when they start creating badges and certifications are a whole other kettle of fish. It is useful in that, Travelist and their work with OTAs is starting to bring it understanding and knowledge, I would call, to the average consumer. They really must be careful about the claims they're making, though, and what it is that they're telling the consumer. And I think that's where Travelist comes in, trying to get some consistency across what the OTAs are saying and doing. But the OTAs they've been slowly coming along. They've got great power.
I had a question about Shannon. I know you're sick of being asked this question about the business case of sustainability, and that's a side of it. I'm curious about the impact of the experience of COVID through all of this. And do you find, whether you're talking to government panels, Daniel, or you're talking to people in the tourism industry about climate-related issues, does the experience of COVID make people go, I'm tired, I don't want to talk about this, I just need to get my business done and get back on track? Or does it kind of reveal, like in one of your slides, Daniel, you talked about, COVID was a bit of a blip in comparison to what climate change could be and will be if we don't act. And does it kind of make people go, holy smokes, we've actually got to do something about this? Have you seen a shift in how people are more willing or more engaged or more interested to talk about the impacts of climate change and tourism through COVID?
You want to go first, Shannon?
Sure, yeah. I think so. But it also depends on how robust your business was, and if you actually had a war chest that you knew you needed that you didn't have. So if you didn't have that war chest, then yes, solvency was your number one priority. If you were a conservative business built with a bit of a war chest, then you also knew this was the best time to take a look at what it is you're doing from a sustainability perspective, because your operations teams are down and they're some of the smartest minds in the business, so let's use them. So that was the approach that we took, and there is a war chest behind them. But we were able to galvanize and use all those really, really clever people at this organization, mostly the operations people. Again, sustainability will live and die by your ops guys, not your marketers. And we were able to do a lot of work with their full attention that we otherwise would not have been. But again, I have full buy-in. I'm my CEO, my chairman. I get emails regularly on how we're doing on net zero, Shannon, when I need some time. So yeah, I think that there was, it was 2 camps, Tom, and I think it really depended on the health and well-being of your business. Though I do think that there is, whether or not it's understood or recognized, there's a great appreciation. We now know what a cessation of travel will do to us. And so when you argue that there are future cessations to come, people are more willing to talk about how to stop those.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think there was like a polarizing effect, that those who were progressively thinking of sustainable tourism writ large, not just the climate file, but had that opportunity to pause, think strategically. Those who were just out there to pay the bills were just waiting for the floodgates to open up again and do what they did before without changing a whole heck of a lot. We have seen some destinations, whether they be sort of a community to a country like New Zealand, stepping back and strategically looking at, as Shannon said, climate change is one thing that's coming, but so will probably our additional pandemics. Like, we will have disruptions, perhaps like this magnitude or similar, sometime in our lifetime. It's not just one and done. Those are probably coming too. So countries like Barbados and others were sort of, okay, we're highly dependent on the tourism economy. Is there something beyond tourism? Like, there's only so much sketchy banking you can do. So if it's not that, what else do we have going? Some have gone the digital nomad sort of route to try to actually bring people in for longer periods of time. They're still technically on tourist visa. But a country like New Zealand is actually actively looking at what part of our tourism system might we stop doing because of either its carbon footprint or other things, so that they sort of future proof. And they're working with Air New Zealand and others. How can we get sustainable aviation fuel sourced either internally or with real partners so we can position ourselves well? So I think there are definitely some strategic conversations happening, but there's the other side of the coin where it's business as usual as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting, that polarization effect. That's quite an interesting insight from both of you. So yeah, I can see how, depending on how you've been doing, that would affect your response to all of that. So thank you. I think that's a good point to call it. And so I'm just going to give a couple of closing remarks and say, first of all, just thank you so much to Daniel and Shannon for your presentations and your willingness to take our questions and answer them very candidly. And I think we got a lot out of it. So thank you very much, and really appreciate your time and effort for this, and excited to see more from you both in the academic world and from the industry about what the Travel Corporation is doing. So thank you very much. I'd also like to say thanks to Sonia for helping organize this, of course. Sonia's the director of the Institute, and to Danny, who helped put a lot of the promotion of this together. I would also like to, on behalf of Rachel Dodds, a bit of a shameless promotion. Rachel is now an author, and she is offering a deal on her new book, available from your favorite online bookstore. It's called Are We There Yet? I'll leave that up there for now, but just a couple of dollars to get this book. If you are associated with children in any way, whether you're a parent, an uncle, a sibling, or somebody, this is the book for you. So please take a look and support Rachel in this new endeavor. So that's it. So thank you so much. Wish you a happy World Tourism Day, and we will see you at our next event. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Daniel. Really appreciate it. Nice to see you both.
Feel better, Sonia.
Yeah, feel better.
Yeah.
Sonia.
Thanks, guys.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.